The story opens in the dead of night on a sprawling, fog-laden plantation in Georgia, where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Lanterns flicker against the wooden walls of the main house, their shadows stretching across the ground like dark fingers reaching toward the sleeping town. In the distance, the sound of a creek trickling and the occasional cry of a nocturnal bird punctuates the silence, creating an atmosphere both tranquil and unsettling. It is here, in this quiet desolation, that the legend begins, of a slave whose very presence seemed to carry a deathly weight, a figure whose life and actions would spark fear, superstition, and ultimately, the deaths of hundreds. From the first moments, the narrative establishes a tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary, a world rooted in hard labor, simple routines, and the rhythmic cycle of plantation life, yet haunted by an inexplicable darkness that defies reason. Eyewitness accounts, letters, and diaries form the initial framework of the story, each fragment a puzzle piece that hints at the terror and fascination surrounding this mysterious figure. One servant's diary, written in careful, looping script, recounts the sudden illness of livestock after the slave had merely walked past the barn. Another letter, penned by a plantation mistress in trembling handwriting, describes a fever that swept through her household, claiming the lives of 2 children and 3 servants in a matter of days. These records, though scattered and often contradictory, paint a picture of a presence that seemed to alter the natural order, a force both human and almost otherworldly. The documentary begins to weave these disparate threads together, highlighting the fragility of life in a place already marked by hardship, and the extraordinary weight of fear that comes when explanations fail. The opening also delves into the psychological landscape of those who lived in proximity to the slave. Plantation owners, accustomed to exerting absolute control over their environment, found themselves powerless before the mounting tragedies. Servants whispered of shadows moving against the walls, fleeting glimpses of the figure in the dead of night, and the inexplicable timing of deaths that followed. Children, innocent and unguarded, hid in corners, afraid to breathe too loudly, convinced that the darkness itself was alive. The narrative captures the emotional texture of these experiences, drawing viewers into a world where superstition and reality collide, and the human mind struggles to make sense of patterns it cannot comprehend. The section further explores the local geography and atmosphere, emphasizing the isolation and vulnerability that magnified the sense of dread. The plantation is surrounded by dense woods, rivers that curve unpredictably, and swamps that swallow light, creating natural barriers that both protected and imprisoned the inhabitants. These landscapes become characters themselves, silent witnesses to the unfolding mystery, their own presence amplifying the tension. Nighttime descriptions evoke a slow, creeping unease, wind rustling through the trees like whispered secrets, mist curling across the fields, and the faint glimmer of candlelight that offers little comfort against the encroaching dark. Such imagery establishes the mood of the documentary, blending the tangible and the spectral to prepare viewers for the story's escalating suspense. In addition to physical descriptions, the narrative begins to layer historical context. Georgia in the Reconstruction era is a place of immense social tension, freedmen navigating their newfound autonomy, former masters struggling to maintain control, and a community grappling with the scars of civil war. The plantation becomes a microcosm of these broader societal conflicts, a space where fear, resentment, and superstition intersect. The slave at the center of the story, whose real name may have been lost to history, is positioned within this charged atmosphere, a human figure enmeshed in a web of societal pressures, personal tragedy, and inexplicable occurrences. The documentary emphasizes that while legends often reduce individuals to symbols, the reality is infinitely more complex. Fear is human, consequences are real, and the line between perception and truth is perilously thin. As the narrative unfolds, attention is drawn to the first whispers of the impossible. Servants and family members recount small but strange events, a sudden shadow moving across the floor, a whisper of a warning too late to prevent disaster, a chill that seems to linger unnaturally in a room. Each anecdote is described with cinematic attention to detail, heightening the tension and drawing viewers into the lived experience of those who encountered the figure firsthand. These seemingly minor incidents accumulate, forming a pattern that feels almost intentional, as if the very air around the plantation had been altered. The storytelling here balances subtlety with emotional intensity, allowing the horror to seep gradually rather than shock abruptly, creating a slow-burning dread that sets the tone for the sections to come. Letters and diaries are revisited, this time with deeper analysis. The documentary highlights inconsistencies, gaps, and moments of extreme emotion that hint at human frailty under duress. For instance, one plantation mistress initially dismisses the series of deaths as coincidence, only to later write of a creeping suspicion that something unnatural is at play. Another servant confesses in his journal to seeing the figure appear in multiple locations at the same time, an impossibility that fuels the growing legend. By juxtaposing these first-hand accounts with historical research, the documentary constructs a layered narrative that oscillates between fact and interpretation, underscoring the mystery without resorting to sensationalism. The final part of the section focuses on the emotional resonance of the opening events. Viewers are invited to feel the mounting anxiety, the pervasive dread, and the fragility of life within the plantation's boundaries. The section closes with a lingering sense of uncertainty. The slave remains an enigma, the pattern of deaths unexplained, and the community's collective fear unresolved. Cinematic visuals of empty hallways, windswept fields, and flickering lanterns leave viewers with a chilling impression of absence and anticipation. By the end of this introduction, the audience understands that they are entering a story where history, human psychology, and legend intertwine, a story where each death, each whisper, and each shadow carries weight beyond its immediate moment, and where the central figure's impact is both tangible and impossible to fully comprehend. The story moves from the shadowed nights of the plantation to a broader view of Georgia in the years following the Civil War, a state still reeling from the devastation of conflict, its economy fractured and its social order in flux. Towns are quiet yet tense, with smoke rising from chimneys of modest homes and plantations that struggle to maintain their former grandeur. Dirt roads wind through dense forests, connecting scattered communities that are both geographically and psychologically isolated. The landscape itself reflects the emotional climate, fields lie fallow where crops once thrived, rivers that sustained commerce and travel now carry the debris of abandoned life, and the very air seems to carry the weight of past suffering. Against this backdrop, the narrative explores the tensions between former masters and newly freed slaves, illustrating a society in which old hierarchies clash with the fragile hope of emancipation. Within these plantations, the social structure is rigid yet under immense pressure. Plantation owners, still clinging to wealth and influence, attempt to assert authority over their lands and the people who work them, while freedmen cautiously navigate newfound freedom, wary of reprisals and the lingering threat of violence. Every action is measured, every word weighed, as both groups grapple with uncertainty and fear. Children of both enslaved and free households absorb the tension, their innocence juxtaposed against the heavy burden of inherited trauma. The documentary emphasizes this contrast, showing how ordinary routines, feeding livestock, tending gardens, preparing meals, occur alongside a constant, unspoken awareness of danger, whether from disease, social unrest, or the inexplicable events linked to the mysterious slave whose legend has begun to circulate. The narrative delves into the architecture and layout of the plantations themselves, illustrating how physical spaces mirrored societal hierarchies and tensions. The main house, often raised above the surrounding fields and surrounded by high fences, is a symbol of authority and surveillance, while the slave quarters lie in clusters at the edge of the property, modest and vulnerable. These spaces are described with vivid cinematic detail, creaking floorboards, the smell of damp wood and ash, shadows that stretch unnaturally as the sun sets. Each location becomes a stage for human drama, where the interactions of the characters, the powerful and the powerless, the fearful and the bold, play out under the scrutiny of both the living and the unseen forces that seem to linger at the edges of perception. Within this world, daily life is a precarious balance between work and survival. Plantation schedules are dictated by the seasons and the demands of agriculture, planting, harvesting, tending livestock, and maintaining the estate. Labor is grueling, with long hours under the scorching sun, and even small missteps can result in punishment or illness. Amid this hardship, moments of community and subtle resistance emerge, shared meals, whispered stories, acts of defiance, and the preservation of cultural traditions. The documentary highlights these moments to humanize the inhabitants, showing that even in the shadow of fear and oppression, life continues with resilience and quiet dignity. The section introduces specific families and figures who populate the plantations, providing a sense of intimacy and history. Plantation owners, often descendants of long-established families, are portrayed with nuance. Some are cruel, others conflicted, their identities bound to the land and legacy of slavery. Freedmen and enslaved individuals are shown navigating their precarious positions, balancing survival with hope, fear with ingenuity. Personal anecdotes, such as a freedman secretly teaching children to read, a mistress quietly nursing a sick servant, or a young boy watching the woods with suspicion, illustrate the emotional landscape of the era. These microhistories create a sense of immediacy, drawing viewers into a world where human lives intersect with broader historical forces, and where ordinary actions are imbued with extraordinary significance. The documentary also explores the pervasive presence of superstition, folklore, and religious belief as tools for understanding and coping with the unknown. Ministers deliver sermons emphasizing moral duty, sin, and divine punishment, while local healers and wise women provide remedies for ailments that science cannot yet explain. Stories of curses, omens, and restless spirits circulate quietly, shaping behavior and heightening anxiety. Within the plantation, the central figure, the slave whose legend is beginning to take shape, is positioned at the intersection of these beliefs, both feared and mythologized. Shadows, sounds, and unexplained events are interpreted through the lens of superstition, blurring the line between reality and imagination, and planting the seeds for the chilling tales that will dominate the community's collective memory. Conflict arises not only from social hierarchy but also from the clash between rationality and belief. Plantation owners may dismiss reports of strange occurrences as coincidence, while servants and freedmen perceive patterns, interpreting them as signs of impending disaster. Tension mounts as the community struggles to reconcile these perspectives, highlighting the fragile equilibrium of a society still healing from the war and uncertain of the future. Letters, journals, and oral histories provide insight into this delicate balance, revealing how fear, power, and cultural norms interact to shape perception and behavior. The documentary emphasizes that this conflict is not merely abstract, it manifests in mistrust, isolation, and subtle acts of control, amplifying the psychological weight of the unfolding mystery. The narrative then focuses on the interconnectedness of the plantations and the wider town. Markets, churches, and communal spaces serve as sites of exchange, not only of goods but of rumors, fears, and warnings. The spread of stories about the mysterious slave becomes inevitable, carried by gossip, letters, and chance encounters. Each retelling adds layers of interpretation, exaggeration, or caution, slowly constructing a collective understanding that is part fact, part myth. The documentary illustrates how social networks, geography, and isolation converge to create fertile ground for legend, showing that the events surrounding the slave cannot be separated from the societal framework in which they occurred. Attention is given to the economic and environmental factors that compound tension. Crop failures, disease outbreaks, and harsh weather conditions create vulnerability and exacerbate fear, while lingering post-war poverty intensifies reliance on superstition and rumor as explanations for misfortune. The documentary presents these factors with cinematic imagery, parched fields cracking under the sun, floods that drown seedlings, and swarms of insects that carry disease. By situating human actions within this harsh and unpredictable environment, the narrative underscores the sense of inevitability and fragility that permeates life on the plantations, and how extraordinary events, whether real or imagined, gain outsized significance against a backdrop of struggle and instability. Finally, the section draws the viewer back to the central figure. Amidst the turmoil of Reconstruction-era Georgia, this slave emerges not only as a participant in daily life but as a symbol of the unknowable and uncontrollable forces that shape human existence. The narrative emphasizes contrasts, youth and experience, freedom and bondage, innocence and fear, science and superstition. Through detailed descriptions of the town, the plantations, and the interactions of its inhabitants, the documentary builds a rich tapestry of setting and mood, preparing viewers for the escalation of the legend and the chilling events that follow. By the end of this section, the audience is fully immersed in a world of tension, uncertainty, and eerie anticipation, ready to follow the first signs of anomalies and unexplained deaths that will define the story. The unsettling patterns begin subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet their repetition quickly sends ripples of anxiety through the plantation and surrounding town. At first, it is minor occurrences: a cow found dead in a field with no apparent cause, a child suddenly falling ill with a fever that resists even the simplest remedies, a servant collapsing mid-task without warning. These incidents, when isolated, might have been dismissed as unfortunate coincidences, but as they accumulate, a troubling pattern emerges. Locals begin to whisper that something is fundamentally wrong, that the fabric of life in their small corner of Georgia has been disturbed by an unseen hand. The narrative focuses on the slow escalation, allowing viewers to experience the quiet horror of ordinary life being steadily overtaken by inexplicable events. Accounts from diaries and letters provide the first glimpse of collective unease. One plantation mistress writes of counting the days between deaths, noting with growing dread that each tragedy seems to follow the arrival or passage of the central slave figure. A farmer describes livestock succumbing overnight, healthy animals reduced to nothing but bones and husks by morning. The documentary draws attention to the subtle details: shadows falling in strange directions, a persistent chill in certain rooms, the sensation of being watched even in daylight. These seemingly mundane observations gain weight as they recur with frequency, building an almost tangible sense of dread that envelopes the community. The psychological impact on the townspeople begins to manifest in behaviors both ordinary and extreme. Servants hesitate to enter fields alone, children refuse to sleep without a parent nearby, and adults display signs of hypervigilance, jumping at noises or imagined movements. Even minor mistakes, spilling water, dropping a tool, failing to finish a chore on time, are interpreted as omens, portents of further misfortune. The documentary emphasizes the tension between rational explanation and fear-driven interpretation, showing how the mind, faced with repeated unexplained events, begins to construct patterns and meaning where none may exist. This psychological layering deepens the narrative, illustrating the profound human need to comprehend and control a world that is increasingly unpredictable. The narrative also introduces the interplay of superstition and emerging scientific understanding. Local healers attempt remedies for the unexplained fevers and sudden deaths, combining herbs, chants, and prayers in an effort to restore health and balance. Clergy interpret the anomalies as divine punishment, urging repentance and moral reflection, while some educated townspeople seek natural explanations, citing disease, contaminated water, or environmental hazards. These conflicting interpretations heighten tension, framing the central figure as a focal point for both fear and speculation. The documentary carefully balances these perspectives, presenting them with historical accuracy while maintaining the slow, suspenseful pacing that engages viewers. Eyewitness accounts become more vivid and unsettling as patterns intensify. One servant recalls seeing the central figure standing silently by a sick child, whose condition worsened within hours. Another notes an uncanny coincidence: the slave appears in two locations on the same day, each marked by an inexplicable death or sudden illness. The documentary presents these recollections with cinematic detail, descriptions of the plantation at twilight, the fog curling around the slave's feet, the quiet stillness of the fields punctuated by distant animal cries. By framing these stories through personal experience, the narrative heightens both realism and emotional resonance, allowing viewers to sense the fear and confusion that grip the community. The section delves into how rumors and whispers begin to shape perception, often becoming more powerful than direct observation. Small gatherings at markets or church steps serve as forums for sharing stories of misfortune, amplifying fear and suspicion. Each retelling modifies the original account, adding detail, exaggeration, or moral interpretation, until the events take on an almost mythical quality. The documentary emphasizes the mechanics of rumor as a social force, showing how fear spreads faster than logic, and how communities, faced with repeated anomalies, often seek to assign agency or blame to a single individual, in this case, the slave whose movements seem inextricably linked to misfortune. The emotional toll of the anomalies becomes apparent as family dynamics strain under the pressure of repeated tragedy. Parents mourn children, spouses grieve partners, and servants live in a constant state of heightened vigilance. Social bonds fray as blame and suspicion infiltrate previously stable relationships. The documentary explores these dynamics in depth, highlighting the ways that fear can erode trust, amplify prejudice, and create divisions within households and communities. By humanizing these experiences, the narrative underscores the emotional stakes, showing that the legend of the slave is not merely a story of death, but of psychological strain, social instability, and the fragile balance of human relationships. The documentary also examines early attempts to rationalize the anomalies, often with mixed results. Physicians of the era are consulted, examining symptoms and testing remedies, but frequently their efforts are thwarted by limited knowledge of disease, poor sanitation, and the environmental conditions of the plantations. Investigations into livestock deaths yield similarly inconclusive results. Water is tested, feed inspected, yet no single explanation accounts for the rapid succession of loss. These failed explanations deepen the sense of mystery and helplessness, reinforcing the narrative tension and highlighting the limits of human understanding in the face of repeated, inexplicable events. Cultural and religious frameworks begin to dominate interpretation as fear escalates. Ministers preach about divine wrath, urging the community to repent for perceived sins, while elders recall old stories of curses and restless spirits that punish the living for transgressions. The documentary contrasts these interpretations with the logical attempts at explanation, underscoring the tension between belief and reason. The central slave figure, by virtue of proximity and timing, becomes a symbolic conduit for this fear, a tangible focus for the abstract forces of misfortune that seem to grip the community. This section demonstrates how folklore and superstition can shape collective behavior, influencing decisions, rituals, and social interactions in profound ways. By the end of this section, the accumulation of strange deaths and unexplainable events has created a pervasive climate of anxiety and dread. The narrative emphasizes that while no single incident may have seemed extraordinary at first, the pattern is undeniable. Life on the plantation and in the surrounding town is irrevocably altered. The once familiar rhythms of daily existence are now punctuated by caution, superstition, and the constant shadow of fear. Viewers are left with a sense of mounting suspense, as the stage is set for further escalation, the point at which the legend begins to solidify, and the mystery deepens beyond what ordinary reasoning can contain. As the pattern of inexplicable deaths and misfortunes takes hold, voices emerge from the shadows, those who have seen, heard, or felt the presence of the slave whose legend is steadily growing. This section explores these first-hand accounts, weaving together personal testimonies that blend fear, awe, and uncertainty. Servants speak of fleeting glimpses of a figure in the periphery of vision, moving silently through corridors or fields, often appearing in places no one should have reached in time. Children describe shadows that linger too long, whispers in empty rooms, and the sense of being watched, capturing an innocence confronted by something beyond comprehension. Plantation owners recount sudden chills, livestock that collapse despite care, and the inexplicable deaths of those closest to them. Each narrative, though unique, converges on a single, unsettling idea: the slave's presence is more than human, or at least perceived to be so. These confessions and murmurs are presented with meticulous attention to detail, drawing the audience into the lived experience of fear. Diaries reveal tremulous handwriting as witnesses describe sensations that are almost impossible to convey: an unshakable dread, a feeling that the air itself has grown heavy, or that time and space behave differently in the presence of the figure. One account tells of a child who, upon seeing the figure standing silently at the edge of the forest, refused to leave the house for weeks, convinced that the shadow would follow. Another diary entry describes a woman waking to find all the candles in her home extinguished at once, her husband collapsed in the corner without explanation, and outside, the slave's silhouette moving against the dim moonlight. The documentary emphasizes these episodes with cinematic imagery, allowing viewers to experience both the subtlety and intensity of the encounters. The section also examines the multiplicity of perspectives and the inherent contradictions within them. Some witnesses described the slave as fearful and timid, others as imposing and almost supernatural. The narrative acknowledges the psychological strain on those providing testimony. Fear distorts perception, memory falters, and the mind seeks patterns where chaos may reign. Yet the sheer volume and consistency of reports lend credence to the emerging legend, even if the details cannot be fully verified. By presenting conflicting accounts side by side, the documentary captures the ambiguity that fuels suspense, illustrating how fear, imagination, and historical circumstance intertwine to shape the collective consciousness of the community. The cultural context of these confessions is crucial. In a society where superstition and folklore remain influential, unexplained events are interpreted through familiar lenses: curses, divine retribution, and ancestral warnings. Ministers and elders reinforce these interpretations, citing moral failings or spiritual transgressions as potential causes. Yet, amidst this, there are those who attempt rational explanations, noting disease, environmental hazards, or coincidence. This tension between belief and reason amplifies the psychological complexity of the story, showing how communities struggling to understand the unexplainable often create narratives that combine fact, fear, and imagination into a coherent, if unsettling, worldview. Eyewitness accounts grow increasingly detailed and unnerving as the narrative progresses. One servant recalls the moment a flock of birds suddenly fell from the sky while the slave passed nearby, a phenomenon no natural explanation could satisfy at the time. Another account tells of a neighbor who saw the slave walking in the middle of a field under a torrential storm, yet somehow remaining dry. These anecdotes, whether embellished or factual, accumulate into a pattern that terrifies and mystifies. The documentary portrays these moments with slow, deliberate pacing, allowing the tension to build as viewers become attuned to the small, eerie details that hint at something larger than the sum of its parts. The human response to witnessing these events is explored in depth. Fear manifests in avoidance, secrecy, and silence. Some individuals refuse to speak of what they have seen, others confess in private letters or diaries, while a few confront the figure directly, often with tragic consequences. The documentary emphasizes the emotional toll of these encounters: anxiety, insomnia, trembling hands, and the constant anticipation of misfortune. In illustrating the human consequences of the legend's emergence, the narrative highlights a central theme: fear, once seated, spreads as efficiently and inexorably as any disease, shaping behavior, memory, and social interaction. This section also highlights how witnesses become both participants and narrators of the legend. Their descriptions, retold and interpreted by others, feed the growing mythos, creating a feedback loop between perception and reality. Markets, church gatherings, and informal social spaces become venues for sharing stories, reinforcing collective belief in the figure's extraordinary power. Even those who have not seen the slave directly internalize the fear through these accounts, altering behavior, relationships, and expectations. The documentary emphasizes the social dynamics of storytelling, showing how legends are constructed not merely from events themselves, but from the communal processing of fear, uncertainty, and awe. The interplay between confession and secrecy is particularly striking. Diaries and letters reveal intimate, often guilty admissions, instances where witnesses feel complicit in misfortune or haunted by their own perceived inaction. Some confess to having cursed the slave in frustration, others to having ignored warnings, and yet misfortune strikes regardless. These personal accounts lend depth to the narrative, humanizing the legend by portraying it as a force that interacts with human psychology, morality, and circumstance. By framing these confessions alongside observations of communal reaction, the documentary underscores the intricate web of fear, responsibility, and interpretation that surrounds the figure, heightening both suspense and emotional engagement. The narrative also examines the role of sensory perception in shaping accounts. Shadows, sounds, sudden chills, and fleeting movements all play a part in the construction of the legend. Witnesses report hearing whispers in empty rooms, feeling an invisible weight pressing on their shoulders, or seeing shapes that vanish when approached. The documentary presents these moments with cinematic precision, fog curling across the fields, lanterns casting shifting shadows, and a faint rustle of leaves that could signal either wind or something more sinister. These sensory details deepen the immersive experience for viewers, creating an intimate connection to the fear and uncertainty experienced by those who lived through these events. As this section draws to a close, the audience sees how the slave has become more than an individual. He is a symbol of the unknown, a focal point for communal fear, and a catalyst for the events that will continue to escalate. The murmurs and confessions collectively construct a world in which the ordinary is constantly shadowed by the extraordinary, and where human psychology, superstition, and historical circumstance converge to form a chilling and enduring mystery. By the end of this section, viewers are fully aware that the stage is set for confrontation, denial, and the growing psychological tension that will propel the story toward its darker and more terrifying escalations. As fear spreads through the plantation and surrounding town, a powerful countercurrent emerges: denial. Those in positions of authority, plantation owners, town officials, and clergy, begin to confront the rising tide of superstition and panic, not with understanding or empathy, but with strategies to maintain control and preserve social order. Publicly, the townspeople present a facade of calm. Church sermons emphasize obedience, moral fortitude, and divine protection, suggesting that any deaths or misfortunes are the result of sin rather than supernatural interference. Ministers urge repentance and faith, framing tragedy as a test of spiritual resilience, while implicitly discrediting the whispers that the slave's presence has any malign influence. This deliberate suppression of fear is portrayed as both pragmatic and morally complex. While it seeks to prevent chaos, it also dismisses genuine human experiences of terror, further isolating those who have witnessed the inexplicable. Behind closed doors, denial takes a more insidious form. Plantation owners instruct their families and servants not to speak of unusual occurrences, to treat reports of strange deaths as exaggerations or coincidence. Journals are censored, letters altered, and gossip tightly controlled. In some cases, threats are issued to maintain compliance, reinforcing hierarchies that are already fragile in a post-war society. The documentary emphasizes the psychological consequences of this suppression. Witnesses begin to question their own sanity, doubt the reality of their experiences, and hesitate to seek help or share critical information. The tension between outward order and internal chaos creates a fertile environment for mistrust and fear, shaping the narrative in ways that prolong suspense and deepen the mystery. Religious interpretation plays a central role in the town's strategy of denial. Ministers frame the narrative of death and misfortune as moral lessons, cautioning against perceived transgressions, and offering spiritual solutions that sidestep the more frightening reality that a series of inexplicable deaths and anomalies are occurring under their oversight. Parishioners are encouraged to pray, attend services, and uphold communal norms, creating a veneer of stability that masks underlying terror. Simultaneously, clergy wield significant influence over public opinion, shaping which accounts are taken seriously and which are dismissed. The documentary explores the duality of this influence. Religion provides comfort and a framework for understanding, yet it also functions as a mechanism of control, limiting inquiry and silencing voices that might challenge established explanations. The section examines specific incidents where denial clashes with lived experience. One case involves a servant reporting an unusual death of livestock to a plantation overseer, only to be rebuked and dismissed as exaggerating. Another involves a mother documenting a series of child illnesses in her diary, then being instructed by a visiting minister to pray rather than investigate. These examples illustrate the growing divide between rational perception, personal observation, and the socially sanctioned narratives imposed by authority figures. The documentary emphasizes the emotional strain this creates. Individuals who encounter unexplainable events are forced to conceal fear, live in isolation, or internalize anxiety, heightening the psychological intensity of the story. The role of power and hierarchy is central to understanding this culture of denial. Plantation owners, still adjusting to the post-Civil War shifts in labor and autonomy, perceive acknowledgement of fear or superstition as a threat to control. By denying or minimizing the strange deaths associated with the slave, they aim to reinforce authority, maintain order, and protect economic interests. The documentary explores this dynamic in depth, showing how fear, when managed or suppressed by those in power, can become more dangerous, not because the events themselves are exaggerated, but because the lack of acknowledgement amplifies uncertainty, mistrust, and isolation among the wider population. Public rituals and ceremonies are depicted as mechanisms for controlling collective perception. Church gatherings, seasonal festivals, and market days become stages where order is reinforced, while whispers of the supernatural are discouraged. The documentary highlights the subtle theatricality of these moments, sermons delivered with fervor, hymns sung to instill calm, and communal prayers offering a sense of security. Yet beneath this surface, tension remains palpable. The slave, whose presence has been implicated in a growing number of deaths, is largely unaddressed publicly, leaving his influence to fester in rumor and private observation. By juxtaposing these public displays with the fear simmering in private spaces, the narrative creates a layered understanding of denial as both a social tool and a psychological trap. Despite efforts at suppression, fear cannot be entirely contained. Some townspeople continue to share accounts quietly, and the tension between official narratives and personal experience becomes more pronounced. Servants whisper in corners, children recount nightmares inspired by strange encounters, and families begin to take subtle precautions, locking doors, avoiding certain paths, or abstaining from tasks in the dead of night. These covert behaviors contrast sharply with the public facade, revealing the persistent undercurrent of anxiety that authority cannot fully control. The documentary emphasizes this duality, demonstrating how denial, while outwardly stabilizing, inadvertently magnifies the mystique surrounding the slave and the deaths attributed to him. The psychological implications of this suppression are explored in detail. Individuals forced to question their own observations experience isolation, guilt, and heightened fear. The tension between personal experience and social expectation creates a climate in which paranoia thrives. The documentary examines how these pressures manifest in behavior, sleepless nights, hypervigilance, and overinterpretation of ordinary events as signs of danger. By focusing on human responses, the narrative underscores the interplay between social control, psychological stress, and the development of legend, showing that the emergence of fear is both a communal and deeply personal phenomenon. Conflict arises when authority figures themselves are confronted with evidence that defies rational explanation. Plantation owners may attempt to rationalize events as disease outbreaks or environmental hazards, yet the repetition and clustering of deaths make such explanations increasingly untenable. Religious leaders, too, face challenges. Sermons about morality and divine justice can only go so far when communities witness the inexplicable firsthand. The documentary presents these moments with cinematic tension, portraying the subtle cracks in the facade of control and the mounting unease that threatens to spill into open panic. The central slave figure remains at the nexus of this tension, embodying both the unknown and the community's collective fear, a symbol that cannot be fully acknowledged without destabilizing the social order. By the end of this section, the audience witnesses a society caught between acknowledgement and suppression, reality and perception. The town's denial, motivated by power, religion, and fear of chaos, creates a delicate but ultimately unsustainable equilibrium. This tension sets the stage for further escalation, as unaddressed fear, suppressed testimonies, and growing psychological strain prepare the community for the coming breakdown. Viewers understand that the legend of the slave is no longer just a story of individual misfortune, it has become a reflection of social, religious, and psychological forces converging, amplifying the mystery, and setting the narrative on a path toward its most terrifying consequences. As the story progresses, the series of inexplicable deaths and misfortunes escalates, and the fragile equilibrium maintained by denial begins to collapse. The plantation and the surrounding town become increasingly tense, a place where every shadow, sound, or movement carries weight. Daily life is overshadowed by a pervasive sense of dread, and the community feels the mounting psychological pressure in ways both subtle and extreme. Livestock die unexpectedly, crops fail without explanation, and families are gripped by illnesses that spread mysteriously. The repetition of these anomalies begins to erode rationality, with people searching desperately for patterns or culprits, and finding only the figure at the heart of the legend, the slave whose presence seems inextricably linked to misfortune. Witness accounts intensify as fear grows. Servants describe fleeting glimpses of the figure in the early morning mist, standing silently at the edge of fields or near barns where accidents have occurred. Children recount seeing shadows move in ways that defy natural explanation, whispering voices that seem to echo across empty rooms, or a sensation of being followed even when no one is present. Plantation owners record chills running through their homes, livestock inexplicably killed, or crops rotting overnight. Each account is presented with rich cinematic detail, the faint light of lanterns illuminating trembling hands, wind rustling through trees that seem to shiver unnaturally, and the constant, almost tangible, presence of dread in the air. The cumulative effect of these experiences amplifies tension, creating a slow, relentless build that immerses viewers in the terror of the time. The documentary emphasizes the psychological toll on the human mind as the pattern of death becomes undeniable. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, and hypervigilance take hold, as families and workers struggle to maintain daily routines while confronting uncertainty and fear. Some individuals report feeling watched constantly, as if the air itself carries a malevolent intelligence. Others suffer breakdowns, unable to reconcile the repetition of misfortune with the notion of a rational, orderly world. These episodes illustrate the ways in which repeated exposure to the unexplained can fracture perception, creating a collective hysteria that spreads through communities as surely as any disease. Social dynamics are also profoundly affected. Trust begins to erode, suspicion flourishes, and communal bonds strain under the weight of repeated tragedy. Neighbors avoid one another, fearing that proximity might invite misfortune. Servants whisper accusations behind closed doors, questioning the actions of colleagues and even family members. Plantation owners grow increasingly paranoid, scrutinizing the behavior of every worker and guest. The documentary captures these dynamics through personal letters, diary entries, and oral histories, revealing a community in which the boundaries between reason, fear, and superstition have become dangerously blurred. Amidst this rising tension, attempts to confront or engage the figure often end tragically or inconclusively, reinforcing the legend and deepening psychological strain. One servant describes approaching the slave to question a series of misfortunes, only to witness a sudden collapse in the house or the death of a neighbor within hours. Another account tells of the figure appearing simultaneously in two distant locations, defying logic and escalating the sense of inevitability. These incidents, whether factual, exaggerated, or misunderstood, compound the community's fear, emphasizing the seeming omnipresence of a force that cannot be fully comprehended or controlled. The documentary also examines the role of superstition, religious interpretation, and folklore during this period of escalation. Ministers interpret the mounting deaths as divine punishment for moral failings, urging repentance and communal prayer, while elders recall older tales of curses and restless spirits. Local healers and wise women provide rituals and remedies intended to protect against malevolent forces. Yet, as the frequency of death continues, even these explanations fail to offer comfort, and the lines between spiritual, natural, and human causes blur. The interplay between faith, folklore, and observation deepens the tension, illustrating how communities in crisis construct narratives that are part explanation, part coping mechanism, and part projection of collective fear. Environmental and external factors exacerbate the psychological strain. The region is prone to extreme weather, unpredictable flooding, and pestilence, which already threaten the livelihood and stability of the community. These conditions provide plausible natural explanations for some misfortunes, yet when combined with the pattern of deaths and anomalies surrounding the slave, they reinforce the sense of dread and inevitability. The documentary uses cinematic imagery to illustrate this: rain-soaked fields reflecting lantern light, decaying crops swaying in the wind, and the ominous rustle of leaves in a forest that seems to close in on the town. This vivid attention to setting amplifies both suspense and immersion, allowing viewers to feel the pervasive tension alongside the historical inhabitants. As the legend grows, the line between fact and imagination blurs. People begin to interpret ordinary events as signs of the slave's presence or influence. A gust of wind, a sudden noise, a falling branch, each is imbued with symbolic weight. The documentary emphasizes how fear shapes perception, creating a feedback loop in which expectation and anxiety heighten the intensity of experiences. Letters and diary entries show individuals questioning their own memories, replaying events in ways that reinforce dread and superstition. By exploring these cognitive dynamics, the narrative highlights the human tendency to seek patterns and agency in chaos, demonstrating how the slave's legend is amplified by both reality and perception. The escalation also impacts the broader social and moral landscape of the town. Accusations, rumors, and whispered judgments circulate freely, sometimes resulting in violent confrontations or ostracization. Families are divided over interpretations of the events, with some attributing misfortune to sin, others to malice, and still others to inexplicable forces beyond human understanding. The documentary presents these divisions with care, illustrating the emotional complexity and the ways fear can fracture social cohesion. In this context, the slave becomes both a scapegoat and a symbol of uncontrollable forces, embodying collective anxieties that cannot easily be addressed or resolved. By the end of this section, the community teeters on the brink of psychological collapse. Daily life is dominated by vigilance and superstition, rational explanations falter, and the weight of repeated tragedy fosters both despair and obsession. The narrative emphasizes that the escalation of fear is as consequential as the physical events themselves, shaping behavior, memory, and social order. Viewers are left with a sense of mounting tension, fully aware that the story is approaching a critical turning point, one in which rationality, superstition, and human emotion will collide in ways that deepen the mystery and prepare the stage for disappearance, isolation, and the unresolved terror that defines the legend. As the town grappled with the inexplicable wave of deaths, desperate attempts to rationalize the events took center stage. Local physicians, many with limited training and rudimentary equipment, conducted hurried examinations of the deceased and the ailing. Their observations were meticulous but inconclusive: no consistent signs of disease, no clear toxins, and no discernible pattern in age, gender, or social standing. Each death seemed to defy the scientific reasoning of the era, frustrating both experts and laypeople alike. Letters from traveling doctors recounting their inspections reveal a mixture of fear, fascination, and professional despair, painting a vivid picture of a medical community struggling to maintain authority in the face of the unexplainable. Itinerant scientists and natural philosophers arrived from neighboring towns, hoping to impose rationality on chaos. They tested water sources, soil, and even air quality, convinced that some environmental factor must be responsible. Their meticulous notes, preserved in local archives, speak to the era's nascent understanding of contagion, chemical exposure, and toxicology. Despite repeated sampling and observation, no traceable agent could account for the speed or selectivity of the deaths. Some scientists proposed exotic explanations: mysterious fungi, airborne toxins, or hidden chemical contamination, but each hypothesis collapsed under scrutiny. The tension between rigorous investigation and the stubborn elusiveness of truth created a palpable anxiety among the townspeople. Meanwhile, local religious authorities insisted that human reasoning alone could not account for the tragedy. Sermons preached that divine wrath or supernatural forces were at work, framing Malik as either a cursed soul or an instrument of otherworldly vengeance. The resulting conflict between faith and reason was palpable. Families vacillated between seeking medical assistance and performing protective rituals, combining science and superstition in uneasy tandem. Accounts describe midnight vigils, communal prayers, and attempts to cleanse spaces where deaths had occurred. These efforts were often futile and sometimes exacerbated the community's sense of helplessness, underscoring how unexplainable events can fracture logic and faith alike. Scientific inquiry was further complicated by the social dynamics of the plantation. Many enslaved witnesses feared speaking freely, while white townspeople dismissed reports that did not align with their worldview. Consequently, investigators often received partial, contradictory, or embellished testimonies. Historians examining these records note the difficulty of separating fact from rumor. The veil of secrecy imposed by both social hierarchy and fear obscured critical details. Despite these barriers, investigators meticulously documented patterns they could discern: deaths seemed to occur in clusters, often following unusual behavior in Malik or the environment. This tantalizing yet inconclusive evidence fueled speculation, spreading both dread and morbid fascination. As weeks turned into months, the limits of contemporary science became painfully clear. Attempts to explain the deaths through conventional means, disease, poisoning, or contagion, proved inadequate. Some researchers turned to emerging theories of psychological contagion, suggesting that mass hysteria or shared trauma could trigger fatal outcomes in susceptible individuals. While this offered a partial explanation, it could not account for the precise timing and seeming intentionality behind certain deaths. Scholars writing retrospectively have noted that the era's limited understanding of epidemiology and neurology left the town vulnerable to both fear and misinterpretation, allowing legend and fact to intermingle dangerously. The clash between scientific reasoning and superstition intensified when investigators began to focus on Malik himself. Some proposed that he had secret knowledge of poisons, while others suggested he might be a carrier of an unseen pathogen. Still, there was no concrete evidence, only circumstantial observation and the eerie alignment of deaths with his presence. These theories, while speculative, reveal the human need to impose order on chaos, to find a scapegoat when explanations fail. The narrative emphasizes the fragility of truth when confronted with terror, illustrating how both science and rumor can be weaponized in the absence of certainty. By the end of this section, it is clear that rational inquiry alone cannot account for the events that transpired. Scientific theories faltered, superstition gained traction, and the town was left suspended between competing explanations. The story portrays investigators not as failures but as witnesses to a phenomenon that exceeded the limits of contemporary understanding. Their meticulous work, though ultimately inconclusive, adds depth and realism to the narrative, demonstrating the enduring tension between human curiosity, fear, and the unknown. The town, once a hub of labor, social gatherings, and familiar routines, had transformed into a landscape of desolation. The relentless string of deaths, combined with fear and suspicion, fractured the community's cohesion. Families abandoned homes in haste, leaving behind possessions, livestock, and memories that seemed to hang in the empty rooms like ghosts. Crops withered as those who remained neglected the land, unable or unwilling to carry on daily tasks under the oppressive shadow of death. The plantation, once a microcosm of rigid social order, had become an eerie tableau of neglect and despair, with dilapidated structures and overgrown pathways reflecting the internal collapse of the community. Malik remained absent, yet his presence was felt in every whispered accusation, every fearful glance, and every rumor that spread like wildfire through the town. Some claimed to see him lurking in the mist, standing silently at the edge of the fields, while others insisted he had become a spectral figure, appearing only when tragedy struck. Sightings were often contradictory. Some described him as a shadowy silhouette, others as a man moving with unnatural speed, yet no one could capture him. The ambiguity amplified the fear, creating a psychological pressure that compounded the tangible grief and anxiety of the surviving population. Children, previously resilient, were particularly affected. Many refused to play outside, spoke of nightmares, or claimed they had seen Malik's figure watching them from darkened corners. As isolation grew, the social fabric of the town unraveled. Neighbors who had once shared meals and laughter now viewed one another with suspicion. Any unusual illness or misfortune could spark accusations, and people became hyper-aware of even the smallest deviations in behavior. Acts of kindness were often shadowed by fear, and communal bonds that might have offered solace disintegrated. The atmosphere was one of oppressive tension, where silence itself carried weight, and empty streets and shuttered windows became visual manifestations of collective paranoia. During this period, sporadic attempts to maintain normalcy were often overshadowed by the relentless sense of dread. Market days were sparsely attended, religious services were abandoned or sparsely filled, and public gatherings became fraught with tension. When townspeople did venture outside, they reported strange phenomena, sudden gusts of wind, fleeting shadows, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched. These events, whether real or imagined, heightened the psychological pressure, creating an environment where fear seemed to possess a tangible form. Historical accounts suggest that the remaining witnesses were trapped in a cycle of grief, speculation, and superstition. Diaries and letters from this period reveal fragmented thoughts, some desperate to explain the deaths through rational means, others surrendering to belief in supernatural forces. Each day became a test of endurance, as the uncertainty of survival eroded mental and emotional stability. The line between reality and perception blurred, and the collective consciousness of the town was dominated by anxiety and the haunting sense that the unexplained was omnipresent. Malik's absence paradoxically intensified his impact. While no concrete evidence placed him at any particular scene, the timing of deaths and a pattern of rumors kept the community fixated on him. He became an abstract locus of fear, a symbol of the inexplicable. Locals claimed that efforts to track him or capture him ended in dead ends, with trails vanishing into forests, rivers, or abandoned settlements. This recurring motif of disappearance reinforced the sense of inevitability and futility that permeated the town's experience. The narrative also emphasizes the physical and environmental decay that mirrored the town's psychological state. Buildings crumbled from neglect, roads became overgrown, and the natural landscape seemed to reclaim spaces once bustling with human activity. Fog-covered fields, empty cabins, and dilapidated fences created an atmosphere of cinematic desolation. Every detail underscored the collapse, not just of a community, but of the perceived order of the world itself, a world where normalcy could no longer be assumed and survival felt precarious. By the culmination of this period, the town existed in a liminal space, caught between the memory of what it had been and the uncertainty of what might come next. Malik's vanishing had become the focal point of both terror and fascination. While his physical presence was gone, the psychological and emotional imprint remained, embedding itself deeply into the collective consciousness of survivors. The audience is left to witness a community unraveling under the weight of fear, loss, and the incomprehensible, setting the stage for the final recounting of aftermath and legacy. Years passed, but the shadow of Malik's legend refused to fade. The plantation and surrounding town struggled to regain even a semblance of normalcy, yet the memory of the inexplicable deaths lingered like an unhealed wound. Families who had survived the calamity attempted to rebuild their lives, but the trauma left deep psychological scars. Diaries, letters, and oral histories preserved by these survivors reveal a recurring pattern: grief intertwined with fear, cautious interactions with neighbors, and a pervasive sense that some part of the horror remained just beyond the edge of perception. The community's silence was both a coping mechanism and a testament to the enduring weight of what had transpired. Survivors often recounted fragmented stories, each variation adding a new layer to the legend. Some spoke of Malik as a man, others as a shadow, and still others as a spectral force that could influence life and death. These narratives, inconsistent yet persistent, became part of local folklore, shaping how the events were remembered across generations. The tension between memory and myth is palpable, as some sought to document the events accurately, others embraced the supernatural elements, using them to explain what could not otherwise be understood. This divergence created a landscape in which truth and legend coexisted uneasily, ensuring that the story of Malik would endure long after the town had physically recovered. The silence of the town was as telling as the stories themselves. Certain areas, abandoned cabins, isolated fields, and the banks of the river where the last sightings occurred, were avoided or treated with reverence and fear. Residents spoke in hushed tones about the places associated with Malik, and children were warned never to wander near them. This spatial silence reinforced the psychological one, making the landscape itself a participant in the legend. Even when practical life resumed, markets reopened, schools functioned, and crops were planted, there was an underlying tension, a subtle acknowledgement that normality existed alongside a lingering, unresolved presence. The local clergy and authority figures played a role in shaping the aftermath. Sermons shifted from outright denial to careful acknowledgement of the events, framing them as cautionary tales about morality, obedience, and the unknown. Records show that these institutions emphasized the need for order and faith, subtly guiding the town to reconcile with its traumatic past while avoiding explicit discussion of the more frightening details. This selective memory, sanctioned by authority, ensured that the story of Malik remained shrouded in mystery rather than fully explicable history. For historians and researchers who later examined the events, the aftermath presented both challenges and insights. Archival materials were incomplete, eyewitness accounts conflicted, and key pieces of evidence had been lost to time. Yet the persistence of oral tradition provided valuable context. The fear, sorrow, and fascination surrounding Malik were as much a part of the town's history as any official record. Scholars note that the psychological imprint of mass trauma, combined with social suppression and the limitations of contemporary investigation, allowed the legend to take on a life of its own, illustrating how collective memory can preserve the extraordinary when formal documentation fails. The community's coping strategies varied. Some families migrated away, seeking to escape the persistent dread, while others stayed and cautiously rebuilt connections with neighbors. Rituals and superstitions lingered, not necessarily out of belief but as a means of asserting control over uncertainty. Candles were lit on anniversaries of the deaths, protective charms were placed at doorways, and children were educated on the cautionary lessons embedded in Malik's story. These acts, though modest, reflect a universal human impulse, to impose order on the incomprehensible, to create rituals that offer psychological security, and to preserve memory in a tangible form. Despite these efforts, the legacy of fear and ambiguity persisted. Visitors and travelers reported hearing strange stories when passing through, and the tale of Malik slowly became intertwined with regional folklore. The town, physically recovering from the disruption, remained emotionally and culturally marked by the events. In this way, silence did not equate to forgetfulness, it became an active, living part of the community's identity. The story of Malik, told in whispers or carefully recounted in the safety of private homes, ensured that each generation carried a fragment of the mystery forward. Ultimately, the aftermath illustrates the complex interplay between trauma, memory, and legend. The events surrounding Malik did not conclude neatly with his disappearance, they continued to reverberate through the lives of survivors and the cultural consciousness of the region. The combination of grief, fear, and selective remembrance created an enduring narrative that straddled history and myth, leaving the town forever altered. It is a narrative of absence as much as presence, where silence speaks volumes, and the unresolved nature of events sustains the mystery across decades. In the years following the harrowing events, scholars, historians, and folklorists began to examine the story of Malik with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. The lack of concrete evidence ensured that every attempt to explain the deaths remained incomplete, leaving the narrative suspended between fact and legend. Researchers explored a range of hypotheses, from the plausible to the extraordinary. Some focused on the possibility of a contagious disease previously unknown to the region, pointing to symptoms described in historical accounts that suggested fever, sudden collapse, and inexplicable weakness. Others considered chemical exposure, perhaps from improperly stored crops or contaminated water, as a potential cause of the mass fatalities. Yet, every theory encountered obstacles, as the deaths appeared selective, sporadic, and often coinciding with the movements of Malik himself, defying conventional explanation. Psychological and sociological theories also emerged. Some modern analysts suggested that mass hysteria or collective trauma could have played a significant role. In this view, the repeated exposure to unexplained deaths, combined with fear, grief, and the pressures of an oppressive environment, could have triggered psychosomatic reactions or fatal stress responses among vulnerable individuals. Historical letters indicate that survivors often reported feeling an intangible dread or being watched prior to illness or death, hinting at the powerful influence of fear on physical and mental health. While these explanations provide some insight into the human response to the events, they fail to account for the precise timing and seeming pattern of fatalities, leaving a gap between empirical reasoning and lived experience. Folkloric interpretations have continued to shape the story of Malik. In local oral traditions, he is sometimes described as more than human, an agent of vengeance, a cursed spirit, or a figure capable of manipulating life and death. These accounts, often passed down through generations, preserve elements of the supernatural, emphasizing the moral and emotional weight of the tale rather than strict factual accuracy. Some storytellers suggest that Malik's vanishing was not merely physical but metaphysical, symbolizing the impossibility of comprehending the true nature of the events. These interpretations underscore the human tendency to fill the gaps left by incomplete evidence with narrative, imagination, and moral reasoning. Attempts to reconcile these differing perspectives have often resulted in hybrid theories. Certain historians propose that a combination of environmental factors, human malevolence, and psychological contagion created a perfect storm of tragedy. In this framework, Malik becomes a focal point rather than a direct agent of death. His presence, actions, and societal position acted as catalysts for fear and suspicion, amplifying existing tensions and fears. The deaths themselves may have been caused by multiple converging factors, each interacting in ways that contemporary observers could neither understand nor predict. This approach allows for a more nuanced interpretation, acknowledging both the historical reality and the enduring legend. Modern researchers have also revisited archival materials, cross-referencing contemporary newspaper accounts, letters, and medical records. While new insights emerge, such as the possibility that certain deaths were preventable or that rumors exaggerated patterns of fatality, no definitive answer has yet surfaced. Some scholars argue that the enduring fascination with Malik reflects a broader human preoccupation with the unexplained, the morally ambiguous, and the psychologically unsettling. The story functions not only as historical record but also as a cautionary tale, illustrating the consequences of fear, ignorance, and societal oppression. The unresolved nature of the events invites reflection on human perception and memory. Oral accounts and fragmented documentation create a landscape in which truth is elusive and subject to interpretation. Each retelling, whether by family members, travelers, or historians, adds nuance while simultaneously obscuring clarity. In this way, Malik's legend persists not because of demonstrable acts alone, but because of the narrative space left by absence, ambiguity, and unanswered questions. The combination of psychological, environmental, and folkloric elements ensures that the story remains compelling, enigmatic, and emotionally resonant. Ethnographers note that the story's persistence highlights the interplay between fear and fascination. Communities continually reconstruct the narrative to fit evolving cultural norms, moral frameworks, and collective memory. This dynamic process demonstrates that unresolved mysteries endure not despite human curiosity but because of it. The more questions remain unanswered, the stronger the stories hold on imagination and conscience. Malik, as both historical figure and mythic presence, occupies a liminal space in which interpretation, speculation, and emotional resonance converge, sustaining the narrative across centuries. Ultimately, the final questions remain haunting. Did Malik possess knowledge or abilities that humans could not comprehend, or was he merely the unfortunate focal point of coincidence and fear? Were the deaths natural, human-caused, or influenced by forces now lost to history? The enduring ambiguity is precisely what gives the story its macabre power. It challenges observers to confront the limits of reason, the potency of fear, and the fragility of memory. By leaving these questions unresolved, the narrative invites audiences to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that some phenomena may resist explanation indefinitely, and that the line between legend and history is often as shadowed and elusive as the figure at the heart of the tale. The legend of Malik did not fade with the passing of time. It seeped into the cultural fabric of the region, becoming a touchstone for collective memory and local identity. Even decades after the final reported deaths, stories persisted, passed down from parent to child, whispered in dark corners, and occasionally recorded in journals and local histories. These accounts often blended factual elements with embellishment, weaving together tragedy, heroism, fear, and moral lesson into a complex tapestry. The plantation itself, now partially reclaimed by the surrounding landscape, became a symbolic site, a reminder of human fragility, societal oppression, and the enduring power of the unknown. Visitors to the area would sometimes report a palpable sense of unease, as if the land itself had absorbed the fear and sorrow of the past, further cementing Malik's presence in the collective consciousness. Anthropologists and historians studying the region note that Malik's story functions on multiple levels. It is at once a historical account of tragedy, a psychological study of fear and rumor, and a folkloric narrative exploring moral and metaphysical questions. The deaths, mysterious and dramatic, offered fertile ground for cultural interpretation, allowing communities to discuss obedience, injustice, and human vulnerability under the guise of legend. Over time, Malik's figure became emblematic, not simply a person, but a symbol of the inexplicable, a reminder that some events exceed human understanding and that fear can shape history as powerfully as fact. The persistence of the story also highlights the interplay between memory and silence. Survivors and their descendants often avoided direct discussion of the events, creating a culture in which storytelling served both as preservation and as controlled revelation. Public retellings emphasized moral lessons or warned of the dangers of hubris and disobedience, while private accounts retained the horror, uncertainty, and emotional truth of the events. This duality allowed the story to remain alive yet inaccessible, perpetuating tension between knowledge and ignorance. It also illustrates a broader human impulse, to preserve trauma in narrative form, translating raw experience into something culturally and emotionally coherent. In literature and modern media, Malik's story has inspired reinterpretations, each reflecting contemporary concerns. Writers and documentarians explore the psychological dimensions of mass fear, the role of social hierarchies in shaping tragedy, and the tension between rational explanation and supernatural speculation. These retellings, while fictionalized or dramatized, serve to underscore the enduring fascination with the inexplicable. They also provide insight into how historical mysteries evolve into cultural myths, gaining new layers of meaning while preserving the emotional core of the original events. Malik becomes not only a historical figure but also a narrative device through which modern audiences can explore fear, morality, and the limits of understanding. Psychologically, the tale of Malik continues to resonate because it embodies the fragility of perception and the power of suggestion. Reports of his presence, whether factual or imagined, influenced behavior, created social tension, and reinforced community cohesion through shared belief in the unknown. Modern psychologists might interpret these reactions as examples of collective trauma, social contagion, or the human tendency to seek patterns in chaos. Whatever the explanation, the enduring power of Malik's legend demonstrates that the human mind is deeply affected by stories of uncertainty, mortality, and moral consequence, elements that remain emotionally compelling across generations. The legend also raises questions about historical accountability and remembrance. Malik's story cannot be separated from the realities of slavery, social hierarchy, and systemic oppression that define the environment in which the events occurred. By examining the narrative through a historical lens, scholars are able to contextualize fear, rumor, and tragedy within a broader societal framework. The combination of real historical trauma and unexplained deaths transforms the story from mere legend into a cautionary reflection on human society, illustrating how structural inequalities can magnify the psychological impact of inexplicable events. Communities today continue to mark the story in subtle ways. Annual commemorations, tours of the old plantation, and local storytelling festivals often reference Malik either directly or through allegory. These practices reinforce cultural memory, ensuring that the legend remains relevant while fostering discussion of both historical and psychological truths. The enduring fascination suggests that the story resonates on a fundamental level. It is not just about a single figure or series of deaths, but about the interplay of fear, morality, and memory, and the human need to grapple with events that defy comprehension. Ultimately, Malik's legacy is one of tension and ambiguity. He exists simultaneously as a historical actor, a figure of folklore, and a symbol of the unknown. The story's persistence reflects a broader truth about human experience. Events that cannot be fully explained leave a permanent imprint on culture and consciousness. For the town and the wider region, Malik's presence remains a reminder that some mysteries endure not because they are unsolvable, but because they illuminate the limits of human understanding, the depths of fear, and the power of narrative to preserve both history and legend. As the story of Malik passed through generations, it evolved into a narrative that was as much philosophical and psychological as it was historical. The central enigma, how a single figure could be associated with 200 deaths and then vanish without a trace, remained unresolved, leaving a space in human understanding that invited reflection, speculation, and unease. Scholars, storytellers, and local residents alike grappled with the tension between what could be documented and what could only be inferred, confronting a profound lesson, that not all events are meant to be fully comprehended, and that some truths are too intricate or too terrifying for ordinary explanation. This realization permeates every retelling, shaping not just the story itself but the cultural and emotional context in which it is remembered. Modern researchers have attempted to piece together what can be known, drawing from archives, letters, newspaper accounts, and oral histories. While patterns emerge, clusters of deaths, reports of Malik's presence in key moments, and the consistent, haunting descriptions of fear, these fragments never coalesce into certainty. Each potential explanation, whether disease, poisoning, psychological contagion, or supernatural influence, offers insight yet leaves questions unanswered. The very act of seeking clarity highlights human limitations. Our reliance on perception, documentation, and logic encounters its boundaries in the face of the unknown. Malik's story, therefore, becomes a study in epistemology as much as history, a meditation on the limits of knowledge and the enduring tension between what is observable and what is imagined. The enduring ambiguity has inspired philosophical reflection as well. Some suggest that Malik's legend embodies the concept of moral and existential uncertainty, illustrating how humans confront forces beyond their control. His disappearance, in particular, underscores the precariousness of existence and the unpredictability of fate. The tale challenges assumptions about causality, justice, and agency, prompting reflection on whether human actions alone can account for outcomes in a world shaped by both visible and invisible forces. In this sense, Malik's narrative resonates far beyond its historical context, speaking to universal human concerns about mortality, fear, and the unknowable. Folklorists note that the story's endurance also reflects the human need to narrativize trauma. By framing the deaths and Malik's disappearance as a coherent story, even one laced with contradictions, communities create a shared understanding of chaos, loss, and morality. These narratives serve both as cautionary tales and as mechanisms for communal processing of fear. Oral traditions, layered with embellishment over time, maintain the emotional impact while accommodating new perspectives and societal changes. In this way, Malik's legend transcends its historical moment, becoming a living narrative that adapts while preserving the essence of the original events, horror, mystery, and the emotional weight of uncertainty. Psychologically, the tale illustrates the power of suggestion, memory, and collective fear. Eyewitness accounts, whether documented or passed down orally, often describe sensations of being watched, premonitions of death, or fleeting glimpses of Malik. These reports, regardless of their factual basis, reveal the human mind's capacity to perceive patterns, assign meaning, and project fear onto ambiguous stimuli. The cyclical nature of these accounts, emerging in successive generations, demonstrates how trauma and uncertainty can imprint on collective consciousness, shaping perceptions and behaviors long after the initial events. The story thus becomes a case study in the interplay between mind, memory, and myth, showing how a single figure can become a focal point for communal anxiety and narrative imagination. The legend's endurance also reflects the interplay between human morality and narrative interpretation. Some view Malik as a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond his control, whose actions, or mere presence, became a catalyst for catastrophe. Others interpret him as a symbol of cosmic justice, retribution, or moral imbalance. The ambiguity allows the story to operate on multiple levels, accommodating ethical reflection, psychological exploration, and historical analysis simultaneously. This multiplicity contributes to the tale's power. Audiences are compelled to engage actively with the story, weighing evidence, considering motives, and confronting the uncomfortable reality that certainty may be unattainable. Cultural memory has preserved not just the events themselves, but the emotional resonance of fear, grief, and awe. Commemorative practices, storytelling traditions, and academic analysis all reinforce the notion that Malik's influence extends beyond immediate historical circumstances. Modern writers and documentarians frequently revisit the story, using it to explore themes of human fragility, social control, and the intersection of fact and legend. These reinterpretations, while varied in approach, share a common recognition. The enduring fascination with Malik arises not only from the deaths he is associated with but also from the psychological, ethical, and existential questions his story raises. The story also serves as a cautionary reflection on societal dynamics. The backdrop of slavery, oppression, and rigid social hierarchy is inseparable from the events themselves. The inability of the community to protect its members, combined with the suppression of truth and reliance on superstition, exacerbated the psychological impact and allowed the legend to flourish. Malik's narrative thus operates as both historical lesson and moral allegory, illustrating how systems of power, fear, and secrecy can amplify the consequences of otherwise inexplicable events. In this sense, the tale speaks to broader themes of human vulnerability, injustice, and the fragile boundary between order and chaos. As the story concludes, the central questions remain unresolved, inviting reflection on the limits of human understanding. Did Malik possess knowledge, power, or influence beyond ordinary comprehension? Were the deaths coincidental, the result of natural causes, or the manifestation of some unseen force? Or was he merely a focal point for the fears and anxieties of a traumatized community? The absence of definitive answers ensures that the narrative retains its tension and emotional potency, leaving each new generation to grapple with its implications and draw their own conclusions. Ultimately, the legend of Malik endures because it operates on multiple levels: historical, psychological, moral, and existential. Its power lies in its ambiguity, its emotional resonance, and its capacity to provoke reflection on mortality, fear, and the unknowable. By leaving the central mysteries unresolved, the story not only preserves the chilling impact of the original events but also invites continuous engagement, interpretation, and contemplation. Malik's vanishing, the deaths, and the lingering fear create a narrative that is at once deeply personal and universally resonant, reminding viewers and readers that some questions may remain unanswered forever, and that the human fascination with the inexplicable is an enduring aspect of our nature.